All rise, veuillez vous lever. Please be seated, veuillez vous asseoir.
Good afternoon. Welcome back. So, the floor is yours, sir. Mr. Counsel, you can continue with your presentation.
Bon, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. After having talked about the incidents related on one evidence, I'm now going to turn to contradictory evidence by several. Incident K is one of those events or incidents. It relates to the arrest and detention. It relates an attempted arrest and detention of two other individuals. On the basis of accounts of indirect witnesses, the prosecutor establishes this incident to Mr. Said, and here are the most salient contradictions in that statement. Witness P2105 states that he was told, and I quote, accompanied that day by Korea police officers, end of quote. None of the Korea police confirm that. But on that particular day, the Seleka of the OCRB shot at a fleeing Faka without succeeding in arresting him, and then returned to the Faka to get some members of his family. And then, and I quote, the parents of the Faka went to the OCRB the next day to tell the Seleka that their son had died in the hospital. Car OTP 2081 0037, paragraph 30. That's the first version. P2980, as far as he's concerned, explained that he had been told that the body of Faka had been taken by the Seleka along with the two arrested. Regarding the body, he said that he saw that person in a mortuary with a bullet in the chest. And then he said that that very same Faka died from a bullet in the head. Same third version of the same incident. At the OCRB, he was told, and I quote, the previous night, the Seleka caught 3 armed bandits. One of them resisted and had been killed, and the 2 others were being held at the OCRB. End of quote. Car OTP 2130 6871. So one incident, 3 versions. If you put aside the incidents based solely on one testimony, well then, incident N is the culmination of the lack of evidentiary rigor on the part of the prosecutor. Incident N is a accumulation of unfounded statements without taking into consideration their unlikelihood or implausibility. In the incident N, prosecution relies on P50, is it 3053 and P3056,
toutes deux postérieures
both
à
made
l'arrestation de Monsieur Saïd.
after the announcement of Mr. Said's address.
Dire que ces déclarations
To say that these statements diverge
est un euphémisme.
is an understatement.
P3053 affirme avoir été
P3053
interpellé
states that he was
par
arrested
le chef
by
de l'opération
the head of the operation,
que
Mr.
celui-ci
Said, and that
conduisait
he
le pick-up
was driving the pickup,
dans lequel il était
where he
notamment
found
avec
himself
P3056
with P3056,
et qu'il,
and
le
that
chef de l'opération
the
Saïd,
head of the operation, Mr. Said, and I
portait un
quote,
grand boubou
was wearing a large white
long
boubou,
jusqu'aux chevilles
ankle length,
avec une culotte en
with
dessous
loose trousers
et un
underneath,
turban jaune sur la
and a
tête.
yellow turban on his head.
Car OTP
Car OTP
2130
2130
63 59
6359,
paragraphes 16 et 29.
paragraph 16 to 29.
P3056
P3056
décrit également cette arrestation.
describes this arrest as well,
Je cite.
and I quote,
Le chef de cette
"The
unité
leader of
était
this
un
unit
lieutenant.
was a lieutenant.
Le jour de mon
On the
arrestation,
day of my
il était
arrest,
en civil
he was in civilian
et
clothes
portait une
and was
chemise
wearing
et
a
une
polo
casquette.
shirt and a cap.
Le lieutenant
The
était au volant.
lieutenant was driving,
Les autres détenus
with
et moi
the other
étions assis
detainees
sur
and
les
me
sièges arrière.
were seated in the
Car OTP
back. Car
2130,
OTP 2130 6639,
paragraphes 26 et 28.
paragraph 26 and 28.
Manifestement,
Clearly,
P3053
P3053 and
accordés
P3056
sur leur arrestation,
agreed on their common arrest.
ils ont omis
However,
sur
they
certains
failed to consult each other on the
Mais
details.
reprenons leur histoire.
But let's go back to their story.
Le lendemain matin,
The next morning,
P3056
P3056
commandant Saïd.
met with Commandant Said,
À ce propos, il précise
and he says, as far as this is concerned, and I quote,
Mahamat Saïd
Mahamat
était
Said
corpulent,
was stout,
grand de taille,
tall,
peau noire.
black-skinned,
Ses cheveux étaient ras, courts.
His
et
hair
il
was
avait une
short.
petite barbe.
and he had a small beard.
Ce jour-là,
That day,
il portait une
he
tenue
wore
camouflée
a
des
desert
Il
camouflage
ne portait
outfit.
rien sur la tête.
He wore nothing on his head. End of quote.
Car OTP
Car
2130,
OTP 2130,
66
6639,
paragraphe 34 et
paragraph 34 and 35.
35. Toutefois,
However,
comme vous allez le voir,
as you're going to see,
en plus de changer
in
de
addition to changing his outfit,
tenue, Monsieur Saïd
Mr.
modifie son
Said
apparence.
changed his appearance. As
P3053 déclare à propos du même
3053 states as regards the same day, and I quote,
Saïd
Saïd
s'est présenté à moi
introduced
comme
himself
étant
to
le
me
directeur de
as the
l'OCRB.
director of OCRB.
À ce moment-là,
At that moment,
j'ai pu voir son
I
visage
could see his face
pour la première fois.
for the first time.
Il avait les cheveux noirs très longs,
He had very long black
et
hair
une longue barbe
and a
jusqu'à la
long
poitrine.
chest-length beard.
Poivre et sel,
Pepper and salt,
noir et blanche,
black and white.
car OTP
Car
2130,
OTP 2130,
6359,
6359,
paragraphe 16
paragraph
à
16
29,
to 29,
description physique au paragraphe
physical knees
déjà dans la cellule.
already in the cell.
Nous ne pouvions même pas
We
bouger.
couldn't move at all or sit
Nous
down.
étions toujours debout.
We were always standing.
OTP
Car
2130,
OTP 2130,
6359,
6359, paragraph 41 and 44.
P3056
P3056
rapporte également
reports
cette même arrivée à l'océan,
on the same arrival.
où il a d'abord été
They were first
enregistré au
registered
poste
at the
d'enregistrement,
registration station
puis
and
également
then taken
amené dans la cellule
to the
souterraine.
underground cell.
Je le cite.
And I quote,
Je savais que cette
I
cellule était
knew
célèbre
that this cell was famous.
sous le régime du
Under
président
President
Patassier.
Patasse's regime,
La cellule souterraine
the
était
underground
utilisée.
cell was
Fin de
used.
citation.
End of quote.
Ah, c'est intéressant.
That's interesting.
C'était le car OTP
That is
21
Car OTP
6639.
2130, 6639, paragraph 37. But that's not all. And this is what he says when he arrived in the underground cell.
Selon P3056,
According to
cette cellule
P3056,
mesurant environ
this
4 mètres.
underground cell measured about 4 by 4
Je le
meters.
cite.
And I quote,
Quand ils nous ont jetés dans la cellule,
when they threw us into the cell,
nous n'étions que 4.
there were only 4 of us.
Ceux qui avaient
The
été
ones
arrêtés au
that had
funérailles.
been arrested at the funeral.
Il n'y avait personne
There
dans
was
la
no
cellule où
one
nous sommes
in the cell when we arrived.
Car OTP
Car
2130,
OTP 2130, 6639, paragraph 39 and 40.
Alors s'agissait-il de la
So,
cellule de Schrödinger,
Is this the
à la
Schrödinger
fois
cell,
pleine et vide?
both full and empty?
Le procureur
In any case,
n'est pas non
the
plus
prosecutor
dérangé
seems to have
par
no
le fait
problem with this fact,
qu'alors que P3053
because when
décrit de graves
53 talks
sur
about
lui-même
serious violence
et
against
d'autres,
himself and others,
dont
including
P3056,
P3056,
P3056
P3056 states, as far as he's
OTP
concerned,
2130,
Car
66,
OTP
39, paragraphe 54,
2130, 6039, paragraph 54, and I quote,
Ni moi,
neither I
ni les autres
nor the
détenus
other detainees
qui ont été arrêtés
who were
ensemble à la
arrested
place
together at the
mortuaire
mortuary
n'avons été tabassés dans
were
l'ensemble de
beaten
l'OCRB.
in the OCRB
Je crois que
compound.
Saïd n'était pas vraiment
I believe that
intéressé aux trois.
Saeed was not really interested in the other 3 detainees.
Au-delà de ces contradictions,
In addition to these contradictions,
le procureur
the
occulte
prosecutor
également
overlooks
plusieurs détentions qui
several
ont été réelles
detentions
cette fois-ci,
that were real this time,
probablement, qui
probably,
ont été effectuées sous
which
contrôle
were
judiciaire.
carried on under judicial supervision.
Ainsi,
Therefore,
l'événement J
incident
relate
G
la privation
relates
de liberté
to the deprivation of liberty of
qui a été amenée à
P1429,
l'OCRB
who was
par le
taken
procureur en
there
exercice
by the court to the court by the prosecutor in office.
2043
2043 03 17 paragraph 48 and 49.
Sa détention
His
de
detention
21 jours
of 21 days
s'appuyait sur un contrôle juridictionnel.
relied on the authority of the
En
prosecutor.
effet, P1429
P1429 claims
rendu en tout,
to have attended the court 4 times,
c'est au paragraphe 70 et 71.
paragraphs 70 and 71.
En passant, en France,
In addition, in France, for example, by the way,
qui ferait
a
appel de son
detainee who
placement en
appeals
détention
against
provisoire,
his provisional detention
puis appel
and then
d'un refus de
appeals
demande de mise en liberté,
for release which is
irait
rejected
maximum 3
can
fois
go
au
to
tribunal
court
21 jours.
a maximum of 3 times in a 21-day period.
L'événement R
Incident
relate la
R
détention
relates to the I received a written summons to appear before the prosecutor.
La convocation était envoyée par
He
le
sent the
procureur
summons
lui-même.
via the prosecutor himself, paragraph 17.
Je suis allé
I went
au bureau du
to the
procureur
prosecutor's
avec mon
office
fils
with my
à 15
son
heures.
at 3 o'clock.
À la fin,
At the end,
j'ai demandé
I
au
asked the
procureur si
prosecutor
j'étais en état
if I was
d'arrestation.
under arrest,
Et le procureur
and the
m'a dit
prosecutor
que j'étais
told me
en état
that I
d'arrestation.
was under arrest.
Paragraphe 18.
Paragraph 18.
À 17 heures,
At 5 o'clock,
j'ai été conduit
I
à
was
l'OCRB
taken to the
par des
OCRB
Séléka
by
rattachés au
Selegue
ministère de la
attached to the
Justice.
Ministry of Justice.
Il y avait beaucoup de
There were
détenus,
many detainees,
certains musulmans,
some Muslims,
mais certainement des
but
chrétiens.
also definitely some Christians.
Je n'ai vu aucun blessé
I didn't see any
et
wounded,
je n'ai pas vu des
and I did
détenus
not
se
see
faire tabasser.
any detainees being beaten up.
Paragraphe 19.
Paragraph 19.
À 23 heures,
At 11 o'clock in the evening,
j'ai été libéré.
I was released. Paragraph 23.
Événement N,
Incident
qui
N,
fonde une accusation de crime de guerre et de
Which
crime contre
is-
l'humanité.
which is it a war crime or crime against humanity?
Ensuite, ce manque de rigueur
In
probatoire,
addition to this lack of evidentiary rigor,
le procureur
the prosecutor
éclipse
overlooked
le contexte
the
de
context
l'OCRB
of the OCRB in
en
Bangui
2013.
in 2013.
En l'espèce,
In this
celui
case,
d'une institution
that of an
au
institution
fonctionnement
that
déstructuré.
was not functioning properly.
CAROTP 2130
Car-
57 61, au paragraphe 55 et 56,
21, 30, 57, 61, paragraph
Relate
55 and
des
56
désordres au couvent de
relates to the disorder at the Bimbo convent,
Bimbo, illustre
which
le chaos
illustrates
qui régnait
the
à Bangui
chaos
à cette
that
époque.
reigned in Bangui at that time.
À cette époque,
At that time,
les charismes personnels
personal charisma
prennent le pas sur toute
took precedence
velléité
over
d'organisation
any attempt
institutionnelle.
at institutional organization.
Voici la description
This is
qu'en
the
fait
description
le témoin,
which
P0338.
witnessed P038 makes,
je cite.
and I quote,
À Bangui,
"In Bangui,
chaque chef de guerre Séléka avait
each
son
Seleka
propre
warlord had its own base,
comme le général
such as
Arda,
General Arda,
dont les éléments
whose
étaient
elements
basés à
were based
Sapeur-Pompier.
at Sapir-Pompier.
Le palais
The
présidentiel
presidential palace
était
was
occupé
occupied
par des militaires tchadiens.
by Chadian soldiers.
Aux ordres d'un colonel dont je ne me
Under
souviens
the
pas le nom.
Orders of a colonel whose name I do not
Les Séléka
remember.
avaient deux
The
bases
Seleka
au
had
Congo,
two bases at
l'une près de
Kanrou,
l'état-major,
one near the
l'autre
military
près de l'entrée
headquarters, the
principale,
other near the main
où
entrance,
se trouvait le bureau
where
des
the
passeports.
passport office was located.
La plupart des Séléka que
The
j'ai rencontrés
majority
à
of the
Congo
Seleka
ne
which I
parlaient pas
met
le
in
Sango,
Kanrou did not speak
ils ne parlaient
Sango.
que l'arabe.
They only spoke Arabic.
Je pense qu'ils
I
étaient
think
soudanais,
they were Sudanese
car ils parlaient
because
un
they
arabe
spoke
différent
a different kind of
de celui que
Arabic
parlaient les
than
musulmans
the one
centrafricains.
that they speak in the Central Africa
Je ne
Republic.
comprenais pas ce qu'ils disaient.
So I couldn't understand what they were saying.
Beaucoup d'anciens
Many
officiers
former
de police,
Muslim police
musulmans,
officers,
de militaires
soldiers,
et de gendarmes,
and gendarmes,
mais aussi des
but also
fonctionnaires
civil
qui travaillaient
servants
pour le
who
gouvernement
worked for the government,
s'étaient joints au Séléka.
joined the Seleka.
Car au TP 2130
P
57 61,
0338,
paragraphe 66 et 66.
Paragraph 66 and 67.
De la même manière,
In the same way,
la hiérarchie
The
est de papier
hierarchy
à l'OCRB.
at the OCRB is on paper
Les
only,
témoignages
when studying
lesquels
the
se basent les
testimonies
événements
listed
dans le PCB
in the PCB.
révèle un
It
fourmillement
shows
de
a
chiffres.
multitude of chiefs,
Souvent, M. Saïd n'est pas
but
mentionné.
often Mr. Said himself does not appear in these statements.
P1167 déclare
P67 states, and I
J'ai vu
quote,
Saleh
I saw
et
Saleh
Damboucha
and
emmener des
Damboucha
prisonniers.
taking prisoners.
Je ne me souviens pas
I don't
que
remember
Saïd ait été là ce
Said
soir.
being there that time.
21-27,
2127,
76-71,
76-71, paragraph 20, 138 to 144.
P1289
P
déclare
at 1289
avoir été
states
arrêté par le
that he was
colonel
arrested by Colonel Saleh
emmené
and taken
par celui-ci
by
au
him
CRB.
to the OCRB.
Il mentionne le général
He
Mazang
mentions the officer Mazang, the
et
General
celui qui
Mazang,
semblait son adjoint
and
Seleka,
the one who seems to be his
qui devait
deputy from the Seleka,
originaire du
who
Tchad,
must have been
qui
originally from
semblait
Chad,
la cinquantaine,
who seemed to be in his 50s.
Ibrahim Mahmoud,
And he mentioned the name Ibrahim and
car
Mahmoud,
OTP
car
21-27,
OTB 2127, 7632,
paragraphe
paragraph
42, 46,
43, 46, 60,
59, 60.
59, 71.
Il ne mentionne pas Saïd.
He does not mention Said.
P0481
P0481 does not mention Mr. Said
en
either.
plus de Monsieur
In
Adam,
addition to Mr. Adam,
il désigne comme
he
responsable
refers
de son sort
as the one who's responsible for his fate, and I quote,
Mahamad Saleh,
Muhammad
qui était
Saleh,
chef de la sécurité
who
de Noureddin.
was
et membre de
Noureddin's
son
chief of security and a member of his cabinet.
Je cite toujours.
And I continue with
À
my
l'OCRB,
quote, at the OCRB,
c'est Zakaria
it was
qui était réellement au commandement
Zakaria who was
pendant
really
le
in
temps de la
charge
détention là-bas.
during my detention
On le
there.
surnommé
He was nicknamed
Jamjiago.
Jam Jago.
Il portait une
He
moustache
had a
distinctive,
very distinctive moustache, thin
longue et recoupée
long,
aux extrémités.
and curled at the ends.
Car OTP 2104,
Car OTP 2104,
1024,
1024,
paragraphe notamment
paragraph
88,
in particular 88,
10 et 51.
10 and 51.
P2682
P2692
jamais Saïd,
never mentioned
mais
Saïd,
affirme à propos
but
de
says
Sansou la mort,
about the statement Sans Fou la mort, and I quote,
j'ai eu l'impression
I had the
qu'il était
impression
plus haut placé que
that
le
he was
colonel
higher
de
up
l'OCRB,
than the colonel of
car il
OCRB,
venait
because
libérer parfois
sometimes
des
he would come
prisonniers.
and release prisoners.
Sansou la mort
San Fou la mort
parlait à certains
would talk
prisonniers
to
à
some
l'OCRB,
prisoners at OCRB,
et ils étaient parfois
and they were
autorisés à
sometimes
quitter
allowed to
l'OCRB à
leave
pied.
OCRB on
Il
foot.
amenait également des
He would
prisonniers
also
à
bring
l'OCRB.
prisoners to the OCRB. End of quote. Car OTB 2130, 6685, paragraph 33.
Toujours dans les événements,
Again, with all these incidents,
P0645,
P0645,
en sus de ne pas nommer
in
Saïd
addition
dans
to not
l'organigramme,
naming Said in the organizational
relate ainsi
chart,
le fonctionnement de
recounts
l'OCRB.
the functioning of the OCRB as follows, and I quote,
Car OTP 2083,
Car OTB 23033,
je vais citer les paragraphes 99
and I
et
will
89.
quote paragraph
Je cite.
99 first.
Il y avait des conflits parmi
There
les
were
Sénégalais
conflicts amongst the Seleka and OCRB,
où il y avait trois
where
chefs.
there were three leaders.
Le commandant,
The
qui avait le
commander,
rank de
who
colonel,
had the rank
qui
of
a
colonel
remplacé
and who replaced Yahya.
était le premier
He
chef.
was the first leader.
Le deuxième
The
chef
second leader
venait de l'armée
came
tchadienne.
from the Chadian army.
Il se disait
He
commandant
called
en grade.
himself a commander in rank.
C'est lui qui était l'adjoint.
He was the deputy.
Le troisième était
The
un
third
lieutenant.
was a lieutenant.
Il s'appelait Ibrahim.
His name was Ibrahim or Ib,
Il était très influent
and he was very influential
car il avait fait la
because he
rébellion
had
sur
been
le
in the
terrain,
rebellion on the ground,
contrairement au remplaçant
unlike
Yahya.
Yahya's replacement.
Noureddin était
Noureddin
le chef hiérarchique
Was the
du CRB.
hierarchical head of the
En
OCRB.
tant que ministre de
As
l'Intérieur,
Minister
il
of the
venait très
Interior,
régulièrement
he came
contrôler
very
ce qui se
regularly to check what was going on there.
Il ne se passait pas 2 jours
No
sans que
2 days
Noureddin
went
ne passe
by
à l'OCRB.
without Noureddin coming to the OCRB.
Passait à peu près 4
He
fois
came
par
about
semaine.
4 times a week,
Dans la journée,
during
mais
the day,
également
but
dans la
also in
soirée.
the evening.
P0622 désormais.
P0622, however,
Arrêté sur instruction
arrested
de
on
Noureddin par le
instructions
général
from
Ali
Noureddin
Mahamat,
given by General Ali Mahamat,
ne mentionne pas Saïd.
doesn't mention Saeed.
En revanche,
However,
je cite,
and I quote,
jeune frère
he
de
speaks
Noureddin,
of Noureddin's
dont
younger
j'oublie le
brother,
nom,
whose name I
qui gérait
forgot,
l'OCRB.
who managed the OCRB.
Fin de citation.
End of quote.
Parle également du colonel
He also talks
Zakaria,
about Colonel Zakaria, Car OTB 2022-0121, paragraph 52 and 68, and paragraph 51.
P0481 ne mentionne pas Saïd.
P0481 does not mention
Zakaria,
Mr.
Adam.
Zaid, but mentions Saleh, Zakaria, and Adam.
P2172
P2172
ne mentionne pas Saïd.
does not mention Said.
Excusez-moi, j'ai oublié le carotté
Sorry,
précédent.
I
était
forgot the
2104,
previous reference.
10,
K
24.
OTB
Et pour P2172,
0121, and then 2130 6313.
P2519, arrêté par le colonel Modestri,
Modestry
amené à l'OCRB.
arrested 2519 and took him to the OCRB. And he says
L'OCRB lui
that the
apparaît sous le
OCRB
contrôle du
seemed to
colonel
be under the
Abdul
control
Kader.
of Colonel Abdul Kader.
Je cite,
And I quote,
je l'y ai vu presque
I
tous
saw
les
him
jours.
there almost every day.
L'OCRB était
The
un peu sa
OCRB President.
Un moment. Excuse me for interrupting, but the last point I have to say would be something that we would consider be for private session. the last mentioned point of evidence the Learned Counsel referred to on account of witness protection issues, referring to P2179, please. I just bring this to your attention.
Court officer, let's move into private session.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
We're back in open session, Mr. President.
Mr. Court officer, how long is the defense left with?
Defense has 4 minutes left.
Okay, Mr. Counsel, please. Well, Mr. Counsel, if you have any essential point, I'm not going to to restrict the defense to this extent. If you can stay to the time, if you need a bit more, it's not going to be a big problem, of course.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
thank you, Mr. President.
Un petit problème de communication. Pardon. Un petit problème
A
de
small
communication
problem
parmi nous fait que
of
c'est maintenant
communication.
qu'on demande de passer
So,
au huis clos partiel.
could we perhaps go into private session after all?
What about? Is it about something you're about to say? Okay.
Je le crains, Monsieur le Président.
Okay, Mr. Court officer, then well, let's return all over again into private session.
We're back in open session, Mr. President.
En résumé,
In summary, the prosecutor relies mainly on the testimony of one single person or on contradictory accounts to base his charges against Mr. Said. Among the incidents that meet a minimum evidentiary requirements, the prosecutor does not dismiss those conducted under judicial review. Furthermore, the prosecution makes no mention of the overall disorganization in Bangui in 2013, the reality of a disorganized OCRB that was not headed by Mr. Said, either in practice or not even on paper, because since its creation, the OCRB remained under the leadership of General Mazang. Yet, for these incidents and those associated with the SEDAD, which are equally fragile, and only on that basis, the prosecution requests that Mr. Said should stand trial.
Thank you very much. This then concludes the submissions on the merits of the defense. We will then move to conclusions, and then I'll give the floor to the Office of the Prosecutor for 30 minutes.
Pardon, Mr. President, Your Honors. Part of my presentation will consist of very few slides. They will be shown on Evidence 2. It's not a lot, just a few, but they will appear on Evidence Channel 2. Let me start out with addressing first some of the last points made by the last speaker of the defense team. I will then move back to the points raised by the previous speakers of the defense. Now, Your Honors, I do not have to remind you that questions of intense scrutiny of credibility of witness or chain of custody issues at this stage of the proceedings are not only not persuasive, they don't necessarily belong here to the extent alleged by the defense. However, I would like to briefly state out in response to my learned colleague that the assessment of the prosecution's evidence put forward negates, with respect to OCRB and the responsibility of Mr. Said for crimes committed there, that the prosecution relies on 9 insider witnesses, among them persons who worked for the police as well as on the Seleka side, closely with the suspect. In addition, there's evidence of the crime-based witnesses. Now, my learned colleague from the defense tries to construct from the testimony of these crime-based witnesses, especially in the last portion of his presentation, that there was no hierarchy, no order, no organization at the OCRB. These crime-based witnesses have their perspective, their story to tell. Your Honors, you have the totality of our evidence. You have the insider testimony that complements the testimony of these witnesses. It has to be taken together and viewed together to bring the truth to light. Now, as set out in our pre-confirmation brief, the prosecution does not negate that the prosecution of Carr and the police had access to the OCRB at the time. However, the presence of police officers and the prosecutor did not prevent the crimes from occurring, as the victims tell us, and actually the police officers themselves. I refer you especially to the testimony of P2478 at Carr OTP 2110-0745, page 0759, related to the sous-sol at OCRB. With regards to the OCRB, the prosecution does not argue that it was secret, nor does it negate that other prisoners were detained at OCRB, partially at some point during the relevant time frame. That is all out in the open. In contrast to what happened later at Cedad, which is the natural continuation of what started at OCRB, the OCRB was a pre-existing institution of the Carr government, police, that was overtaken by the Seleka coalition, Mr. Said and his associates at the forefront. However, that there were certain other prisoners, among them also potentially Seleka for theft and burglary, doesn't mean that the targeting of the prisoners didn't happen. That is at the heart of the crimes charged. Their testimony lies before you. The modus operandi, which began at OCRB, continued at the Cedad. There, Your Honors, the crimes were taken to another level. The same persons associated with and with the participation of the suspect, Mr. Said, committed crimes that were only concerning the targeting of certain persons perceived as Bouazizi supporters. The defense here, my learned colleague, Mr. Jacquemin, picks 2 of the 6 insider witnesses the prosecution relies on to establish Mr. Said's individual criminal responsibility at Cedad. 2, and then deconstructs those 2 testimonies alleging hearsay. Now, we have set out in our PCB how the insider witnesses on his criminal responsibility, their testimony, are sufficient to establish substantial grounds to believe his individual criminal responsibility at Cedad. I just want to point out that there's more evidence on the insider level than projected here today by the defense. Let me address the challenges to the chapeau elements of crimes against humanity and war crimes briefly now. The defense argues that there was no ongoing armed conflict between March and September 2013, as there was a cessation of hostilities. Now, the prosecution does not deny that there was a certain lull in armed hostilities after the Seleka had taken over Bangui. However, such a lull does not automatically render international humanitarian law inapplicable. On the contrary, requirements to establish the application of the law of armed conflict do not exclude changes in the composition or configuration of parties or fluctuation in the intensity of hostilities. What matters is that the party to the conflict continues to exhibit characteristics consistent with the capability and resolve to maintain the hostilities, and that it actually does so. The prosecution's evidence shows that this test is met, Your Honors. The prosecution relies on several witnesses on the very inside of the circle around Bouazizi at the time, as well as documentary evidence. The defense today has at length cited a report by the International Commission of Inquiry, which references ICRC, among others. This was disclosed by the prosecution in this case. However, the prosecution relies on evidence obtained from insider witnesses, which were never publicly available and have been cited at length in the PCB. The UN Commission, Your Honors, openly acknowledged its own limitations, referring to the difficulties it had experienced during its investigation and ending with a critical caveat, and I quote at paragraph 94 of the report cited by the defense, "The Commission acknowledges that future analysis based on more detailed accounts of all the many incidents that occurred in this time frame might lead to a different conclusion." Your Honors, next to insider witnesses, the prosecution relies on documents to establish that there was an ongoing armed conflict at the time. I wish to draw your attention to a number of documents on the screen. At evidence 1, a document should appear. Evidence 2, which is a report from the Ministry of Security dated 3rd June 2013. It handles ongoing confrontations. It has been disclosed to the defense and to the chamber in these proceedings and is part of the list of evidence of the prosecution. On the next slide, Your Honors, displayed are 2 Seleka government documents dated July and August 2013. These are reports on the armed activities of Olivier Kudeman, already mentioned by Mr. MacDonald yesterday, one of the leaders of the pro-Bouazizi forces. The prosecution's evidence shows that within 6 months of Bouazizi's ouster, the anti-Balaka and pro-Bouazizi forces, led by Forma Faka and loyalists, launched a large-scale attack, first on Basangoa and its surrounding areas. The witness testimony and the documents that we can provide show a continuation of the armed groups and that this meets the test necessary for a non-international armed conflict at the relevant time. Let me turn to the defense's assertion that the Seleka were not the state, were disorganized, divided, which impacts, in their opinion, on the chapeau elements of both war crimes and crimes against humanity. This argument has been brought in the opening and also is represented heavily in their submissions today. In contrast to the defense arguments, which are almost exclusively based on interpretation of media reporting and reporting by scholars and research, the prosecution's evidence shows that the Seleka coalition was able to overtake Bangui, form a government, usurp and control existing state institutions, coordinate on large-scale military operations, such as in Boyrab, but not only in Boyrab, on a day-to-day basis. The prosecution does not only rely on P0776 and P1167 for the advance on Bangui, the planning and the coordination with regards to this advance. As the PCB sets out, we rely on several other insider witnesses for establishing what happened during this advance. P2105, P0413, P0349, and P0342 are just to name a few, in addition to photographs and reporting on the advance. Now I ask you, Your Honors, how is a coalition that is allegedly completely dysfunctional able to take a capital of a country? Jotodia and the Seleka leaders established a government that began functioning at the latest in April 2013. It wasn't perfect, probably not, no. Nobody alleges that. But there are strong indicia that the government was sufficiently functioning, that the Seleka were sufficiently organized to commit the crimes that are alleged. Contrary to the defense assertion, Chatodia built the government from the coalition, appointing several of his closest allies to ministerial posts. Adam, Dafan. The others appointed were closely cooperating with the Seleka. He ruled by presidential decrees, and the many, many decrees were disclosed in these proceedings. Seleka leaders also occupied bases across Bangui. The control in these bases tended to be vertical, and they commanded these bases with prominent Seleka generals. Should I do that now? The P numbers I mentioned. Your Honors, I'm being told that I should repeat the P numbers for the transcript that I just did. I was too fast there. I will do that quickly. I apologize for being too fast on that. P2105, P0413, P0349, and P0342. I apologize once again. I will slow down now. The Seleka elements were indeed loyal to their respective commanders in these bases. The evidence clearly shows that. But the commanders engaged in a system of lateral coordination and cooperation in order to achieve common goals. After taking power, the Seleka engaged in measures to regularize the Seleka coalition. Indicia are membership ID cards, trainings being organized, food distribution systems being organized across bases. Chatodia himself, as president, created new state institutions such as the SEDAD, as well as the National Security Council. In this council, Nuruddin Adam briefed regularly the Seleka members on aspects of security, including when he became head of the SEDAD. It was all not as disorganized as the defense is keen on wanting us to believe. Your Honors, as you can see on a photograph on the next slide, dated 31st August 2013, even when the Seleka were removed from OCRB, this was conducted in a well-organized and orderly manner. You can see on the far left corner Mr. Said in military uniform. You can also see former President Chatodia and an orderly lineup of members of the OCRB. There are additional strong indicia of sufficient organization to meet the legally required test. At Camp Daru, Chatodia established his own mighty presidential security that coordinated, among others, with the Seleka at OCRB and Adam at OCRB and later at SEDAD. The presidential decree that nominated former members of the Advance on Bangui to powerful positions of that security is disclosed and on the list of evidence at CAR OTP 2004 1385 at 1420 to 14 to 21. Sorry. Seleka commanders from various bases, regardless of their nationality, ethnicity, or political affiliation, high-ranking members of the presidential security, were all present and coordinated with each other during both Boyrab operations. The evidence on that has also been disclosed and provided to the parties. Now, the prosecution does not refute that there were deep lines of division, including on ethnic as well as national borders within the coalition. However, the leaders depended on each other to remain in power and acted accordingly. While the evidence disclosed and summarized in the PCB shows that there was an aspect of a security aspect to the operations in Boy Rob, a disarmament aspect to those operations. The result was that the Seleka targeted these neighborhoods as a whole at least twice in the relevant time frame. It is immaterial whether the main aim or object of an attack was to attack civilians or whether the attack also served other objectives, such as to locate weapons, detain fighters, or other things. What is relevant is that the civilian population was actually attacked, which is the case here. The defense assertion that the looting in Boy Rob was simply ordinary criminality does not suffice to negate that this was part of the policy to target the entire neighborhood. One of our witnesses describes that at least 100 Seleka were looking throughout the day. Once a truck was full, looting throughout the day, Once a truck was full, another would arrive in its place. The testimony part is on slide before you. It is at CAR OTP 2079-0315, paragraphs 26 and 30 of that witness's testimony. These were not isolated acts during these operations. The looting itself was organized, supported. And this is what this witness tells us. Your Honors, the evidence before you shows that the coordinated attacks on the Boy Rob neighborhood involved multiple acts of violence, referred to in Article 7.1. Both operations resulted in murders and rapes, massive lootings of bare necessities. This is based on direct evidence of witnesses, people from those neighborhoods, people who can attest to the fact that that happened. Likewise, the charged incidents are part of this attack. They are connected. There is interlinking evidence. Among those detained at OCRB and SEDAD, they could not reasonably be perceived to be members of the pro-Bouazizi forces. This is evident by looking at their professions and the circumstances of their arrest at the time. The prosecution has so far found no evidence that murders, rapes, and arbitrary detentions were seriously investigated or prosecuted. Those looters who were prosecuted, and the evidence has been disclosed and has been referenced, that have been investigated and partly prosecuted, and the evidence has been disclosed and referenced by the defense, they seem to even have gotten away. And I refer you to a report at CAR OTP 2034 0270 at 0287 and 0302, as well as a UN report at CAR OTP 2001 0329 at 0339. Thus, Your Honors, even though there were isolated attempts to address certain criminality, and there may have been certain individuals at the time who tried to do the right thing, this was not backed up by the organization at the time. Not even for those examples brought forward today by the defense. I close my submissions on that point today, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. Now would be time for the OPCV. I would like to hear from you, Madam Counsel. How long do you think you will need? I don't want to squeeze at all your final remarks, because you haven't spoken in the 1 hour I'd given. So please let the Chamber know how long you would believe you would take.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. The circumstances in which I prepared my closing statement are such that I am not able to tell you exactly how much time I will need. So I would rather present all my observations in one stretch, and if it were to extend beyond 4 p.m., I would be asking you to let me conclude after 4 p.m. Otherwise, you could authorize me to do my presentations in one stretch tomorrow morning.
Well, look, we want victims to have their say without any time constraint, so I will adjourn the hearing to tomorrow. Tomorrow we will hear from you, and we will hear the final statements from the defense. So the hearing now is adjourned at tomorrow at 9:30. I would like to thank everyone, and especially our esteemed interpreters, the courtroom officers, technical staff, and everyone who has made these hearings possible. Thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon and evening. Thank you.
All rise, veuillez vous lever.